The morning started like any other Tuesday in Willowbrook Heights, our suburban neighborhood where the biggest drama usually involved someone's garbage bins being placed 3 inches too close to the sidewalk. I was Thomas Chen, District Enforcement, officer for the past 8 years, and I'd seen my share of petty disputes, HOA violations, and the occasional neighborly feud. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what I was about to witness on Maple Street. I was driving my official vehicle, a white Ford sedan with District Enforcement emblazoned on the sides, when my radio crackled to life. Thomas, we've got a situation on Maple Street. Possible property damage dispute. Can you respond? Copy that, dispatch. En route to Maple Street, I replied, already mentally preparing for another fence line disagreement or parking violation. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching under my tires as I navigated the tree-lined streets of our quiet community. As I turned onto Maple Street, I immediately knew this wasn't going to be a routine call. A crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, their voices rising in animated discussion. In the center of the commotion stood 2 women, one elderly, frail, and visibly distraught, the other middle-aged with platinum blonde hair styled in what I'd come to recognize as the signature speak to the manager cut. The elderly woman, whom I later learned was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, was standing beside what remained of her mobility scooter. The bright red Jazzy Elite that had been her lifeline to independence was now completely flattened beneath an enormous, terracotta planter that must have weighed at least 200 pounds. Soil and the remnants of what appeared to have been prize-winning petunias were scattered across the sidewalk like confetti at a very sad parade. The blonde woman, Karen, Middleton as I would soon discover, stood with her arms crossed, her face flushed with righteous indignation. She was wearing a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than Mrs. Hartwell's monthly Social Security check, and her manicured nails gleamed as she gestured wildly. "Officer!" Karen called out as I approached, her voice carrying that particular tone that made my teeth ache. "Thank goodness you're here. This woman has been terrorizing our neighborhood for months with that ridiculous contraption." I held up my hand to stop her mid-sentence. Years of experience had taught me to assess situations before letting anyone launch into their version of events. I walked over to Mrs. Hartwell first, noting the tears streaming down her weathered cheeks and the way her hands shook as she stared at her destroyed scooter. "Ma'am, are you injured?" I asked gently, pulling out my notebook. "Do you need medical attention?" Mrs. Hartwell shook her head, but her voice was barely a whisper. No, I'm fine. But my scooter, it's my only way to get around. I can't drive anymore, and my arthritis makes walking more than a few steps impossible. How am I going to get to the grocery store, to my doctor's appointments?" The raw vulnerability in her voice hit me harder than I'd expected. This wasn't just about property damage. This was about someone's independence, their dignity, their connection to the world beyond their front door. I turned to examine the scene more carefully. The planter hadn't just fallen, it had clearly been pushed. Drag marks in the soil showed where it had been shoved from Karen's front yard, across the sidewalk, and directly onto the parked mobility scooter. The precision was almost surgical in its maliciousness. "Can you tell me what happened here, Mrs. Hartwell?" I asked, pen poised over my notebook. Before she could answer, Karen's voice cut through the air like a buzzsaw. "I'll tell you what happened. This woman has been leaving that eyesore parked on the public sidewalk for weeks. It's a hazard. Children could trip over it. It's bringing down property values. I have every right to protect my investment." I held up my hand again, this time more firmly. "Ma'am, I need to hear from Mrs. Hartwell first. You'll have your chance to speak." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of purple, but she stepped back, muttering under her breath about incompetent public servants and tax dollars. Mrs. Hartwell took a shaky breath and began her story. "I was just inside making my morning tea. I always park my scooter right here on the sidewalk. It's perfectly legal, isn't it? I checked with the city when I first got it after Harold passed. They said as long as I wasn't blocking pedestrian traffic and stayed within the designated area, it was fine." She was right. I knew the municipal codes by heart, and mobility scooters were explicitly allowed on sidewalks with proper clearance. "I heard this tremendous crash," she continued, "and when I looked out my window, I saw her," she pointed at Karen, standing over my scooter with that planter toppled over it. She was screaming about how I was ruining the neighborhood and that she was going to take care of the problem herself. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, and I could hear murmurs of agreement and support for Mrs. Hartwell. It was clear that Karen wasn't winning any popularity contests on Maple Street. "That's not how it happened," Karen exploded, unable to contain herself any longer. "I was simply relocating my planter to a better position in my yard. It's not my fault the contraption was illegally parked in a public space. If she hadn't put it there, none of this would have happened." I looked at the drag marks again, then at the distance between Karen's front yard and the sidewalk. The planter would have had to travel at least 15 feet to reach Mrs. Hartwell's scooter. This wasn't an accident or a simple relocation gone wrong. "Mrs. Middleton," I said, using my most professional tone, "can you explain how your planter ended up directly on top of Mrs. Hartwell's mobility scooter? The physical evidence suggests this required considerable effort and intention." Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you accusing me of something, officer?" She squinted at my badge. "Chen. Because I know my rights, and I know people in this town. Important people. People who might be very interested to know that the district is employing officers who clearly don't understand property law or public safety regulations." There it was, the threat that every enforcement officer dreads. The implication that somehow my job was on the line because I wasn't immediately siding with the person who clearly believed their importance trumped everyone else's rights. I'd dealt with Karens before, but this one was operating on a level of entitlement that was almost breathtaking. She had destroyed an elderly woman's mobility aid, something that was quite literally Mrs. Hartwell's lifeline to independence, and was now trying to paint herself as the victim while simultaneously threatening my career. "Mrs. Middleton," I said, my voice carefully neutral, "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm simply trying to understand the facts of what occurred here. The drag marks in the soil and the position of the planter suggest that considerable force was used to move it from your yard to this location." "Maybe the wind blew it," Karen said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe it was an earthquake. Maybe aliens did it. The point is, that scooter shouldn't have been there in the first place." Mrs. Hartwell let out a soft sob, and I saw several neighbors step closer to her, offering comfort and support. An older gentleman I recognized as Mr. Peterson from 3 houses down put a protective arm around her shoulders. "Eleanor," he said gently, "don't you worry about this. We all saw what happened. We all saw her push that planter right onto your scooter. This isn't right, and we won't let her get away with it." The crowd murmured agreement, and I could see Karen's confidence wavering slightly as she realized she didn't have the support she'd expected from her neighbors. I pulled out my phone and began taking photographs of the scene: the destroyed scooter, the planter, the drag marks, the distance between Karen's property and the point of impact. Every angle, every piece of evidence that would be needed for what I was increasingly certain would become a legal matter. "Mrs. Middleton," I said, looking up from my camera, "I need to inform you that destruction of personal property is a serious matter. Mrs. Hartwell's mobility scooter appears to be completely destroyed, and given that it's a medical device essential for her daily functioning, this could be classified as a hate crime against a disabled person." Karen's face went white, then red, then white again. "Hate crime? That's ridiculous. I don't hate disabled people. I just hate having to look at that ugly thing every day. It's an eyesore. It makes the whole street look like a retirement home." The crowd gasped at her callousness, and I saw several neighbors pull out their phones to record the conversation. In the age of social media, Karen's words were about to become very public very quickly. "Furthermore," I continued, "mobility scooters are legally considered the same as wheelchairs under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Intentionally damaging or destroying someone's wheelchair is a federal offense, not just a local property dispute." The color drained completely from Karen's face as the implications began to sink in. This wasn't just going to be a simple civil matter that could be resolved with money and lawyers. This was potentially criminal, federal, and very much a matter of public record. Mrs. Hartwell looked up at me with hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since I'd arrived. Does that mean she'll be held responsible? I don't have the money to replace my scooter and my insurance? Doesn't cover vandalism. I was going to have to become a prisoner in my own home. The heartbreak in her voice. 3 days after the incident on Maple Street, I was back at my desk in the district enforcement office, typing up my final report when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Hartwell Eleanor, and I felt a familiar pang of sympathy for the elderly, woman who had become somewhat of a fixture in my thoughts since Tuesday. Mr. Chen, this is Eleanor Hartwell. I hope I'm not bothering you, but I wanted to thank you again for how you handled everything the other day. And, well, there's something I need to tell you. Something I discovered last night that changes everything. The tremor in her voice was different this time. Not the shakiness of trauma, but something deeper. Something that sounded almost like guilt. Of course, Mrs. Hartwell. What can I help you with? Could you possibly come by my house? I have something to show you. Something about Karen Middleton. Something I should have realized years ago, but I was too caught up in my own grief to see it. An hour later, I found myself sitting in Mrs. Hartwell's modest living room, surrounded by decades of memories. Photographs lined every surface. Wedding, pictures, family gatherings, grandchildren's school photos. The house smelled like lavender and old books, the kind of comforting scent that only comes from a home that's been truly lived in. Mrs. Hartwell sat across from me in a worn recliner, her arthritic hands clutching a manila envelope. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and I could tell she'd been crying. Mr. Chen, I need to start by telling you about my son, Michael, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He died 12 years ago. Car accident. He was only 34, married, to a wonderful woman named Catherine. They had been trying to have children for years, but Catherine had several miscarriages. The stress of it all, combined with losing Michael, it broke her. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I waited patiently, sensing that this story was going somewhere important. Catherine started drinking, heavily. She became angry, bitter, lashing out at everyone around her. She blamed me for Michael's death. Said if I hadn't asked him to come fix my roof that day, he wouldn't have been on the road during the storm. She wasn't wrong, you know. I've carried that guilt for 12 years. Mrs. Hartwell opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of old photographs. She handed me one. A wedding photo showing a young man who looked remarkably like her and a beautiful blonde woman in a white dress. That's Michael and Catherine on their wedding day, she said. Look at her closely, Mr. Chen. Really look at her. I studied the photograph, noting the bride's features, the shape of her face, her eyes, the way she held herself. There was something familiar about her, but I couldn't quite place it. After the funeral, Catherine disappeared from our lives, completely. Changed her name back to her maiden name, moved away. I tried to reach out for months, but she wanted nothing to do with me or anything that reminded her of Michael. I haven't seen or heard from her in over a decade. She handed me another photograph, this one more recent, apparently taken from her window with a phone camera. It showed a blonde woman in a designer tracksuit arguing with someone off camera. I took this yesterday morning, right after I got your business card from our encounter. I was still so upset about my scooter that I couldn't sleep, so I was sitting by my window when I saw her in her yard. For the first time in 3 days, I really looked at her face. Mr. Chen, that woman who destroyed my scooter. That's my daughter-in-law, Catherine. Karen Middleton is Catherine Hartwell. The photograph slipped from my fingers as the implications hit me like a physical blow. The woman who had deliberately destroyed her former mother-in-law's mobility. Scooter, who had shown such callous disregard for an elderly disabled woman's independence, was family. Not just any family. She was the widow of Mrs. Hartwell's deceased son. Are you absolutely certain? I asked, though the resemblance was now unmistakable, once pointed out. Mrs. Hartwell nodded miserably. I spent all night looking through old photos, comparing them to what I could see of her through my window. It's definitely her. She's had some work done, plastic surgery, I think, and she's changed her hair, but it's Catherine. My Michael's Catherine. The weight of this revelation was staggering. All of Karen's behavior, the hatred, the deliberate cruelty, the way she'd seemed to take personal pleasure in Mrs. Hartwell's distress, suddenly made a horrible kind of sense. "Mrs. Hartwell, did you recognize her during the incident on Tuesday?" She shook her head. "I was so focused on my destroyed scooter, and she looks so different now. Plus, it's been 12 years. I never expected to see her again, certainly not living right across the street from me. But now that I know, I remember her voice, that angry, bitter tone. It's exactly how she sounded at Michael's funeral when she screamed at me that it was all my fault." I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. This changed everything about the case. This wasn't just random neighbor harassment. This was deeply personal. This was a woman who had been carrying 12 years of grief and anger and had found herself living across the street from the person she blamed for her husband's death. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. When you moved to this house, did you know Catherine was living across the street?" "No," she said emphatically. "I moved here 8 months ago after Harold passed. I couldn't afford to keep our old house on just my Social Security, and this place was in my price range. If I had known Catherine was here, I never would have moved to this street. Never." "And the mobility scooter. When did you start parking? It on the sidewalk?" "About 6 months ago when my arthritis got worse. I always parked it in the same spot, never blocking the walkway. I even asked the neighbors if it bothered anyone, and they all said it was fine." She paused, then added quietly, "I noticed that the woman across the street, Karen, I thought her name was, always seemed to glare at me when I was coming or going, but I assumed she was just one of those people who didn't like having elderly neighbors." The pieces were falling into place in the most tragic way possible. Catherine, now calling herself Karen, had been watching her former mother-in-law for months, her old anger and grief festering, seeing Mrs. Hartwell every day, using the mobility scooter that represented her vulnerability and need for help, must have been like reopening a wound that had never properly healed. "There's more," Mrs. Hartwell continued, reaching into the envelope again. "After I realized who she was, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She's lived on this street for 20 years. I asked her about Karen Middleton when she moved in, what she knew about her. She pulled out a handwritten note. Mrs. Patterson told me that Karen moved in about 2 years ago, right after her mother died, and left her the house. Her mother's name was Margaret Middleton. Catherine's maiden name was Middleton. She inherited her childhood home, Mr. Chen. She came back to the neighborhood where she grew up." The implications were staggering. Catherine hadn't just happened to end up living across from her former mother-in-law. She had inherited property that put her directly in Mrs. Hartwell's path, creating a situation where two people carrying the same grief over Michael's death, were forced into proximity without either initially recognizing the other. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have to ask, are you afraid of her, now that you know who she is?" Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, staring at the wedding photograph still in her lap. "Afraid? No, not exactly. Heartbroken, yes. Angry, absolutely. But mostly I'm just sad. We both loved Michael so much, and we've both been carrying this pain for 12 years. Instead of helping each other heal, we've become enemies. And the worst part is, she's right." "What do you mean she's right?" "If I hadn't asked Michael to come fix my roof that day, he wouldn't have been driving in that storm. He'd still be alive. Catherine would still have her husband. We might have had grandchildren by now. Everything she's blamed me for all these years is true." The raw pain in her voice was devastating. Here was a woman who had been carrying guilt for 12 years and now discovered that the person who had been tormenting her was someone who had every reason to hate her. "Mrs. Hartwell, accidents are just that. Accidents. You couldn't have known about the storm, and Michael chose to help you because he loved you. His death was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault." She smiled sadly. "You're kind to say that, but Catherine and I both know the truth. The question now is, what do we do about it?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from the district attorney's office. "Chen, need to discuss Middleton case ASAP. New information has come to light. Can you come in this afternoon?" I showed Mrs. Hartwell the message. It looks like there may be more developments in your case. Are you comfortable with me sharing what you've told me with the district attorney? This information could significantly impact how the case proceeds. She nodded slowly. Yes, share it. Catherine. Karen. Whatever she's calling herself now, she needs help. Real help. What she did to my scooter was wrong, but now I understand why she did it. Maybe this can be an opportunity for both of us to finally deal with Michael's death properly. An hour later, I was sitting in District Attorney Rebecca Martinez's office, listening to information that made Mrs. Hartwell's revelation even more complex. Thomas, we ran a background check on Karen Middleton as part of the woo.